Hey everyone, Mark here. Today I'm covering how to descend and land for beginners like me trying to learn the FlyByWire A320. In this video, I'm going to be looking at how to know when to descend, how to prepare the airplane for the approach, and finally how to fly an ILS landing down to the runway, which happens to be the easiest way to land the airplane when you're just getting started. There's a lot to cover again today, so let's get straight to it. Alright, I'm going to continue on from where I left off in the previous video. I'm at a low cruise altitude of 11,000 feet because I'm doing a short hop from Ontario down to San Diego. There really isn't much to be done when you're at cruise other than plan for your descent, which is what I'm going to look at now. I programmed the MCDU with the ILS to runway 9 before I took off, so none of that needs to be done here. Again, if you need to know how to do this, just consult the last video where I cover in detail how to program the MCDU's flight plan. The first thing I need to do is figure out where my top of descent point is, which is where I'm going to start descending from my cruise altitude. My flight plan has me going by the Barrett 5 arrival, so I'm just looking at that chart right now to see what altitude I need to be at when I start my approach. The first waypoint that I'm going to be crossing on that arrival procedure is the Barrett waypoint, and I need to be at 9,000 feet for that. With that information, I can go to the EFB, go into the calculator, and it'll automatically be on the top of descent calculator. I'm going to press sync to get my current altitude from the airplane, and I'm going to set my target altitude in the bottom one, which in this case is 9,000 feet. That's telling me that I need to start descending when I'm about 6 nautical miles out, and underneath that you can see it says I'm supposed to have an angle of descent of 3 degrees. 3 degrees is what the autopilot is going to use automatically, so I don't really need to worry about that part. The easiest way to know when I'm 6 nautical miles out is to go to the progress page, type the waypoint into the scratch pad, in this case is going to be Barrett, and I'm going to load it by clicking on the right hand side in the empty box. Once that's done, you can see the bearing and distance to the waypoint, so when that number hits 6, I know that I need to start descending. I skipped forward a little bit in the flight and I'm now about 6 nautical miles from the Barrett waypoint, so it's time for me to go to the autopilot panel, reduce the altitude to 9,000 feet, and I'm going to press down on the dial to engage it. In a couple of seconds, you're going to see the airplane's going to start descending in a mode called open descent. What that's going to do is it's going to descend to the altitude that I told it to, ignoring any altitude constraints that there are along the way on the route that I'm flying. If I had pressed up instead, I would have engaged it in manage descent mode, which, as you can probably guess, would have respected all of those altitude constraints. I chose open descent mode just to be able to feel a little bit more involved with flying the airplane. Otherwise, you're really just letting the airplane handle everything from takeoff all the way to landing, and it's a little bit boring, to be completely honest. I won't touch anything else on the autopilot panel. Specifically, I won't touch the speed. I'm going to leave that one in manage mode because it's really easy to end up in a lot of trouble when you start controlling the airspeed yourself. One thing that is kind of neat is as I go through 10,000 feet, you're going to see the airplane is actually slowing itself down to 250 knots, which is the speed limit below 10,000 feet. I'm already coming up on the Barrett waypoint because I already had that low cruise altitude. And at this point, it's time to go back to the autopilot panel and put in the altitude for the next leg of my approach. If I have a look at the chart, it's telling me that from Barrett to the next waypoint, I can go down to 6,000 feet. So I'll dial that in and engage it with open descent again. While that's happening, the next thing I need to do is I need to go back to the MCDU, get the weather information for the airport where I'm landing, in this case San Diego, and load it into the approach. The easiest way to get the weather is to go to the MCDU menu, then click on the ATSU menu, the AOC menu, and then finally press on the weather request button. It's going to be automatically loaded with your departure airport and your arrival airport, so all you got to do is press send, and then you can go back up to the AOC menu, go into receive messages, and there we go, we have our first message. I can just print that one off, and it's going to print it out on the bottom pedestal for me. So I can go down there and I can just click on it, and it's going to put it right between the throttles for me, so it'll be really easy to read off what I need to input into the MCDU. With that information, I can go to the perf page and press the activate approach phase and then confirm that so that it brings me to the page where I need to fill in all of the arrival information. The first bit of information that I'm going to load is the altimeter setting, which is the QNH field. And that one's always easy to pick out in the METAR report because it starts with an A and it's going to be followed by 4 numbers, in this case 2986. So I'm just going to type that into the scratch pad and load it into the field. I'm going to do the same thing with the temperature. Again, it's fairly easy to find it because it's going to be just before the altimeter setting, and there's going to be two numbers separated by a slash. Be careful when you're loading the METAR information that you're actually looking at the right airport. I accidentally loaded the Ontario information, which was my departure airport, because it was the first one that printed out, but really it's the second one that I'm looking for San Diego. The last thing to get from the METAR report is the wind heading and speed. Loading this one is pretty much exactly like the other ones. I just type it into the scratch pad, put a slash to separate the heading and the speed, and then I just load it in by pressing on the soft key on the left. For the last part that I need to fill in on this page, I actually need to pull out my approach chart and see what the minimum descent altitude is for the runway that I'm landing on. The A320 is a Class C aircraft, but it doesn't really matter in this case because it's the same MDA regardless of the class of airplane that you're flying, and that's 217 feet. What I'm going to do with that is put in 217 into the scratch pad and load it into the barrow field. What that's going to do is that when we hit 217 feet, the airplane is going to actually call out to say that we're at minimums, and I'll know that that's the point where I need to decide if I'm going to continue with my landing or go around. You can also see on this page, the airplane has calculated that I need to land at 123 knots today, and I need to fly the final approach at 128 knots. The airplane's going to handle all of this for me, and we're actually going to see these airspeeds indicated on the airspeed indicator, so I'll keep them in mind, but I don't need to memorize them because I'll be able to see them pretty easily. The last thing I need to prepare is go to the RadNav page to make sure that the ILS frequency is set up properly. I set all of this up before I took off, so the airplane is actually automatically loaded for me, but if it wasn't there, I would have just taken the frequency of the ILS from the chart and loaded it in manually. Once that's all filled in, it's time to focus on the rest of the approach, and I've just gone by the next waypoint, so it's time to look up on my chart what the next altitude step down is going to be. It looks to be 4,000 feet, so again, I'm just going to go back to the autopilot panel, dial that in, and hit down to engage it. The plane is flying on what is effectively the downwind leg before turning around and coming into land on the ILS. And at this point, I'm going to go to the glare shield panel. I'm going to enable the landing system so that I can see the localizer and the glide slope on the primary flight display. The other thing you need to do while you're here, if you haven't already, is to set the altimeter properly. I've already set it in MCDU, but I've also got to set it here. Otherwise, the airplane isn't going to be getting the right altimeter reading. The plane's also slowed itself down to 200 knots automatically because it knows we're in approach mode now. And this is probably a good point where I can extend the first notch of flaps. Extending the flaps is the airplane's cue to know that it needs to slow down even more towards approach speeds. And you can see it's going to slow all the way down to an airspeed that's marked with an S in the airspeed indicator. In case you're ever wondering if you're flying slow enough to extend the flaps, you can see them on the instrument panel. They're listed right above the secondary attitude indicator. Alright, now that I'm crossing the next waypoint, I need to go back to the altitude dial, tune that down to 2,000 feet, and I'm going to engage it in open descent mode again. I'm leaving the autopilot on for now because, to be completely honest, the first few times I tried disabling it around here and just flying the rest of the approach myself because I've flown a bunch of these with the smaller GA planes. I was like, oh, it can't be that much harder. But I did end up screwing this up a lot that first try, and since then I used the autopilot to get a lot closer in the approach. What I've been doing to get more practice with the airplane is that every single time I'm flying it, I'm disengaging the autopilot just a little bit further out each time on the approach that I'm doing. As we're turning onto the final approach course, you can see that the diamond at the bottom for the localizer is starting to center itself. And once it's intercepted that final approach course, it's going to stay on it for the duration of the time that I leave the autopilot on. Once the plane's just about turned out on final, that's when I'm going to go to the flaps 2 setting, which is going to continue to decelerate the plane more towards our final approach speed. We're also starting to intercept the glide slope at this point. You can see it's starting to come down towards the center. And once that's been intercepted, it's going to use those numbers in order to continue to descend towards the runway. It's going to ignore the value that's in the autopilot setting from there on. I really don't wait too long to go to flaps 3, and what that's going to do is it's going to bring us down to F speed, which is where we would normally extend the last notch of flaps. Once I do get to F speed, I'll extend that last notch right away, just so that that's out of the way. Final approach speed is indicated on the airspeed by that magenta triangle just on the right-hand side of the airspeed indicator. Now that I've gone by the last waypoint of the approach, I can see the runway is about 6 nautical miles away on the top right of the navigation display, so I'm going to drop the landing gear at this point too. While I'm continuing towards the runway, the autopilot is still on, and I'm actually going to make sure that the auto brakes are set to medium. And what that's going to do is the moment that the main gear touches down, it's automatically going to start braking for me. They recommend to use medium for most landings and low if you're going to be landing in rain. I'm also going to arm the spoilers at this point, which means again, once we touch down, the spoilers are going to auto deploy, which is going to help slow us down a lot. So we're going to have 3 things working for us the moment we touch down. We're going to have the spoilers extend, we're going to have the brakes automatically engage, and we'll also be able to enable reverse thrust to come to a stop in as little of a distance as possible. On your first attempts, I really recommend to disengage the autopilot around 500 feet, and as you get a little bit more experience, you can probably do it at about 1,000 feet. It takes a little bit of practice to move something so big. It's nowhere near as responsive as the small GA plane that you would be flying, and it really does take some getting used to. When you disengage the autopilot, you're gonna hear a quick 3 beeps, and that's to tell you basically that you're in charge of flying the airplane from here on out. With that done, I'm listening for the callouts from the autopilot, which is gonna tell me when I hit the minimum altitude, at which point I'm gonna decide if I continue to land or not. As I get closer to the ground, the autopilot's going to continue calling out different altitudes, and when I get to 20 feet, it's where I'm going to start pulling gently back on the stick to start my flare. A few seconds after that, it's going to tell me to retard the throttles, which means I just need to bring them back to idle. As soon as the main gear touches down, you're going to feel the brakes kick in, and you can go into reverse thrust to continue to decelerate the airplane even faster. You can keep reverse thrust on until around 40 knots and then just bring them back to idle. To avoid coming to a complete stop on the runway, because that's what the auto brakes will do if you don't do anything, just tap the brakes once you're ready to take over from it. And with that, you should have a pretty decent idea of how to get the airplane airborne, how to come in for an approach and land. I won't go through the shutdown procedure because, to be honest, most of the time I just end up taxiing to the gate and leaving the sim. But if you're interested in it, you can check the FlyByWire website where it's all detailed. I hope you learned something useful throughout this series on how to fly the A320. I'm going to be doing some follow-up videos in the coming weeks with some more tips and tricks for beginners on flying airliners, so make sure to stick around for that. In the meantime, if you haven't done it already, please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe as well if you haven't already. Your likes and subscribes are what keep this channel growing and what keeps me motivated to make more videos. I'll see you soon.